Hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. And this lecture is all about troubleshooting, authentication and authorization. And when we talk about authentication and authorization, this is all about giving users the ability to access the resources they need to perform their job, no more and no less. And quite often when you're trying to configure something in AWS and it doesn't quite work out, a lot of the time this can be related to not being authorized to access certain resources or make certain API calls. And you may well see in the exam questions or scenarios where they ask you to troubleshoot or where they ask you if a particular action is allowed or denied based on a set of identity access management policies and resource policies. So you're going to need to understand how these policies work in combination with each other. And the main things that you need to remember are that in AWS, authentication and access control takes a least privilege approach. So what that means is that all actions are denied by default, and you need to explicitly allow permissions for the actions that you want your users to be able to perform. And you should already know that an explicit deny will always override an allow. And with multiple policies in play, for example, identity access management policies, S3 bucket policies, access control lists, key policies, etc. An action is only going to be allowed if no method explicitly denies and at least one method explicitly allows access. And finally, if you're using AWS organizations, do check in case there is a permissions boundary preventing the action. So here is an example where we have an S3 bucket policy, and basically this policy is allowing all actions to this user for all S3 resources. So it's a pretty open policy, and on its own, this would allow the user to perform any action on any object within any S3 bucket. However, in combination with an identity access management policy, which includes a deny statement, so here is an example identity access management policy, which includes a deny statement. In this case, the deny statement is going to override the allow statement from the previous policy. So in this case, this deny statement is going to deny all actions against any file with log in the object name. So in this combination of policies, the deny statement is going to override any allow statement. So moving on to troubleshooting identity federation. So another scenario that you might well see in the exam is around identity federation and a user's ability to assume an identity access management role. So for example, you might be trying to use an STS or Security Token Service API to enable a user to assume a role. And one thing that you need to watch out for is that you are using the correct API call for the job in hand. So for example, if your user was authenticated by a web identity provider, so think Facebook, Amazon, or Google, then you need to use the STS assume role with web identity API call. If the user was authenticated by a SAML compliant identity provider, so for example, if you're using your on-premises Active Directory to authenticate your users, in that case, you would use the STS assume role with SAML API call. And if your user is an identity access management user authenticated by AWS, then in that case, you would use the STS assume role API call. So just do make sure that you're using the correct API call for the job, because that can also sometimes come up in the exams as well. So let's move on to our exam tips. Just remember that if you are working with multiple policies, so S3 bucket policies, access control lists, identity access management policies, key policies, etc. Just remember an explicit deny will always override any allow. And also everything is denied by default until you go ahead and allow it. And there's also a really good in-depth discussion of policy evaluation logic in the identity access management documentation. And this is definitely worth reading before you take the exam. And I've included a link to this page in the resources section of the course. And finally, for identity federation issues, make sure that you are using the correct API call when assuming roles. So STS assume role for identity access management users authenticated by AWS, and assume role with SAML if your users were authenticated by your on-premise Active Directory, and assume role with web identity if your user was authenticated using a web identity provider like Google, Facebook, or Amazon. So that is the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.